Hi, everyone. So I'm Nicolas Roulin. I'm from St. Mary's University in Halifax, Canada. And today I'm not going to talk about one specific project or study, but I'm going to give you an overview of the research I have done and others have done on deception and deception detection in the interview context. So as a starting point in the interviewer selection context, when we talk about deception or truth, we usually talk about this within the broader context of using what we call impression management tactics or strategies. So those are behaviors, for instance, job applicants engage in that have the goal of creating a positive impression in the job interviewer, as well as obtaining indirectly positive evaluations during the interview and ultimately getting higher chances to get a job, which is what they are here for. What we know as well is that applicants use such tactics quite extensively. So for instance, earlier research found that almost every applicant used at least one tactic in their last job interview, and on average, they use around 37 of those. So if you think about a job interview being on average, maybe 45 minutes to an hour, they may be using a tactic every 1 or 2 minutes. So it's a lot of them going on in a single event. We also know that some people do lie or engage in some kind of deception in interviews, although those kind of behaviors are not as frequent as general impression management. What's important to understand is in the interview context, we tend to classify impression management behaviors in different categories or types of tactics. So we don't simply look at lie versus true, but we look at different kinds of strategies and how and when they are used. So broadly speaking, we have 3 broad categories. We start with self-focused tactics, which are used by the applicant to highlight their experiences, qualifications, skills, competencies, etc. We have other focused tactics that are there to highlight connections with either the interviewer or the hiring organization. So for instance, praising the organization values or trying to find similarities between oneself and the interviewers in terms of preferences, values, etc. And then we have defensive tactics that are here to actually protect, defend, or repair the image of a good applicant. So for instance, how do you justify that you were employed for a period of time? But then what gets interesting is we can actually distinguish for each of those categories of tactics between honest strategies and deceptive strategies. So for instance, if I'm telling you that I speak Chinese Mandarin, I would be using what we call image creation because I don't, and I'm just making that up. But if I tell you that I speak, German or French or English, then I would actually be using self-promotion because I do know at least some of those languages, and I actually give you information about my true skills and abilities. So the same thing applies to ingratiation that can be honest and deceptive, and also defensive tactics that can be honest and deceptive. And the little description here are examples of items that are used in self-report measures to assess those different types of behaviors. So we have quite a bit of research trying to understand why, when, and how people use those different kinds of strategies. And broadly speaking, for instance, there are individual differences associated with the extent to which applicants use honest versus deceptive type of tactics. So as you can see here from a review of the literature, we see that people that are more extroverted and higher on core self-evaluation tend to use more honest strategies, whereas those that are lower on conscientiousness and higher on dark traits, such as narcissism, psychopathy, or lower honesty, humility, as well as more competitive in nature, tend to use more of those deceptive tactics. There are also situational factors. For instance, in this study, we looked at intention to use deception in job interviews in the future across the 50 largest metropolitan state areas in the US. And the different colors show you how much people were likely to engage in those behaviors across regions. So you have more intention to fake, for instance, in New York, in Detroit, in Sacramento, or Miami than some of the other areas you have highlighted here. And interestingly, in those regions, we also found on average lower level of conscientiousness and higher level of competitive worldviews. There's also research showing differences across cultures or in different countries. So in that example, for instance, they compared 5 different countries and found that people from the US and to a lesser extent China engage in more deceptive behaviors in interview than people from the United Arab Emirates or European countries. So there can be also quite interesting cultural differences in the behaviors. Now, turning to the detection of deception, This slide may be extremely familiar to most of you. We know that people are not very good at detecting deception on average, usually not much better than chance level. Probably all familiar with the Don and DePaulo research, for instance, showing that people are not better than 54% on average. And we also know why people are not great. So there is a tendency to be overconfident in one's ability to identify truth from lies. People tend to rely on the wrong cues to deception, for instance, looking at nonverbal cues that are not very valid and ignoring more verbal or content-based cues that are better, and also a number of biases that can take place, such as truth bias. But what happens in the interview context is sometimes a little bit more complicated than what you may be used to in terms of having participant watching a short video clip and then simply stating whether the clip was truthful or not. In the interview, people may be using a host of different tactics, sometimes at the same time. Sometimes some will be very short, some will be much longer. And in that series of experimental studies here, we try to replicate this kind of level of complexity. So what we did, we had 2 samples with professional hiring managers. We had on average about 10 years of experience interviewing applicants. And then we had 2 samples of completely naive university students who have basically never conducted an interview in their life. And then without going into the details, we had a number of different materials that included short video clips of about 5 minutes of an applicant answering 1 or more interview questions. And so what we did is we created those mock interview by inviting real job applicants to our lab. We asked them to behave like they would do in a real interview if they were very interested in getting the job. So we didn't tell them to lie or didn't tell them to be honest. We just asked them to impress us as much as they could. And so we asked them a bunch of questions. We recorded the answers. And then at the end of that mock interview, we gave them very clear definitions of the different tactics I've showed you before. We did a quick test to make sure they understand how they worked. And then we actually used the software to ask them to identify the different kinds of tactics they use. And not only how much they use them and exactly during the interview, when they use them, which one they used, and then for how long they use them. So for instance, if we're using self-promotion or image creation, we asked them if I started at second 35 and ended at second 59, and they could actually use the software with a keyboard to simply press the right key to tell us when they started, when they stopped. And then we actually showed those videos to our participants and asked them to try to detect when people were using which tactic. And as you can imagine, we are into a bit more complex situation than we usually see in a lot of the deception detection research. So we develop a system that is derived from signal detection theory. So many of you may be familiar with things like hits, correct rejection, false alarms, or missed. So in that case, a hit would be when the participant was detecting the right type of tactic at the right time. A correct rejection would be when they are correctly identifying that there is no tactic going on at that given period of time. Then we had a false alarm, meaning that they thought there was tactic going on when nothing was actually happening. And then they have missed when they actually didn't see what was going on. And then perhaps most interestingly, we have something a bit different here, which is what we call misclassified, meaning that they correctly identified that the applicant was using some kind of tactic, but they didn't figure out the right one. And in many cases, that would mean they thought the applicant was honestly self-promoting when they were actually inventing their qualification, or vice versa. So what it leads to is that we can actually look at a number of indicators. So this is just an example for the first of the 4 studies. And I want to start by highlighting that of all the tactics used by applicants, the vast majority were actually missed by the interviewer, about 73%. There's another 14% that were misattributed, and it's only about 13% that were correctly detected. In that case, the correct detection rate was quite similar for the honest and deceptive tactics. You will see for the other studies, not always the same. And then when the information was not present, we also had a number of what we call false alarms. So a number of times the interviewer thought the applicant was, for instance, lying to them when they were not. You have here a chance level. So again, it's a bit more complicated. I don't have a lot of time to explain that, but what we use is what's called the surrogate method. So basically what we did is we, instead of comparing the coding of the participants, so what they clicked on at what time, to the real behavior of the applicant, we compared that to another video that was different from the one they coded. So it's basically like comparing that to a complete randomized situation where someone was clicking on the button randomly during the 5 minutes of the interview. So they are doing a bit better than chance level, but still the numbers are pretty low on average. Those are the values across the 4 studies. So a few things that are interesting here. Overall, the correct detection was still quite low, especially for HR professionals. They're not doing much better, in some cases even worse than students. And the detection for honest impression management was generally higher than for deceptive one, which is kind of consistent with a lot of the deception detection literature if you compare detection of truth versus lies. But this is, of course, an experimental design, which has limited ecological validity. So what we did, we tried to replicate that in a field setting. So we went to a series of recruiting agencies, and we were able to collect data from both the applicant and the interviewer after about 160 real job interviews for actual jobs. So after the interview, both of them went to separate rooms, and we asked them to report all the types of tactics they use using various skills. And so the applicants reported what kind of tactics they used. The interviewer reported what kind of tactics they thought the applicant used. And then we looked at the correlation between the two for 5 different kinds of tactics or strategies. So you have one, honest self-promotion, and then 4 different deceptive ones. And if you look at the correlations in the diagonal here, you can see that they are pretty small and all non-significant, meaning that the interviewer pretty much had no idea what was going on in terms of the applicant tactics. In that studies and others, we also looked at potential individual differences for the interviewer. So we found that there was no relationship between age, hiring experience, or the number of interviews they've conducted in the career with their ability to correctly identify deception or impression management in general. We found that on average, students that had no experience were pretty much as good as professional interviewers with sometimes several dozens of years of experience conducting interviews. We also, in other studies, looked at individual differences such as cognitive ability, personality, or emotional intelligence. And for none of those studies, we found any relationship with detection accuracy. 2 more things I want to quickly mention. The first one is that, like in a lot of the traditional lie detection research, we also looked at whether there are valid verbal or maybe non-verbal cues to deception in the interview and looking at 4 kinds of tactics they use. So we have slide image creation, which will be embellishments, exaggeration. We have extensive image creation, which will be basically fabrication or pure lies. Image protection will be hiding things from your past in order to protect your image. And deceptive ingratiation would be when you pretend to like the interviewer or the organization when your true value is actually not at all aligned with theirs. And what you can see here on overall is that their relationship are pretty small. Not very many are significant. And for those who are, except for silences, they were not consistently related to all kinds of tactics. So we cannot just say, well, this kind of cue works as a cue for deception in the interview context. It might, but maybe a small cue and only for some kinds of tactics and not all of them. And lastly, we also have done looking at credibility assessment techniques like CBCA. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And what we found is that CBCA is a useful tool to detect deception in the interview context, but there are some caveats. So for instance, it only works if we ask interviewees to respond in a natural setting, but it doesn't work if we give them instructions to lie or to be honest. It works only if we use the overall CBCA score across all the indicators, but not if we look at specific unique indicators. And it does work mostly if the responses from the job applicants includes narrative elements of a story, meaning that they actually provide some contextual information. They actually tell us a story about what happened, what they did, what was the outcome of the situation. And it doesn't work if they remain quite broad about the description, which does again make sense because this is the kind of context for which CBCA was designed. All right, so this was a very brief kind of overview of the research on that topic. I'm happy to answer any question. You can find all the papers I've cited here on my website here, or feel free to reach out to me as well if you want to connect or if you want the papers. Thank you.